Hey guys, I wanted to record a quick lecture on just kind of like some of the specific details of realism. And I know that our textbook in the introduction for Unit 1 talks about realism and kind of some of its subsets and its definition. But I think that we could, go into a little bit more detail, especially considering the fact that your first paper is going to be kind of trying to work out and identify a realist text, a text that follows these characteristics. And so by looking at realism in more detail, I think you'll be able to maybe look at your texts in more detail and kind of find some content for your papers and some different ways that you can approach your readings throughout this first unit. So first, let's kind of look at the definition of realism. Realism in the arts is the accurate, detailed, unembellished depiction of nature or of contemporary life. So accurate, meaning that literary realism is trying to really show what it's really like. I mean, the word real is in here so many times when we're talking about realism. Also detailed, some of the things that I kind of think I included in one of the discussion board questions, maybe in the one that was like the part that didn't really make the cut, was this idea of, James's text being so long in order to get to the heart of the story, and that's this concept of detail. I mean, your authors are really detailing conversations, they're detailing the scene, they're detailing the people, who is involved and what are their details, because I think that maybe the authors of like our realist genre are thinking, okay, if I can present all of the details, then we can better uncover like what is real in this, why this is happening, or why this conversation is going on. How does this character think, and how does that reflect reality for characters like this in real life? So details are important, and that means a lot of our texts are a little bit longer, or at the very least it takes a little bit more to make sense of like why the text is so long. Well, we could have said this in a page, but we took 5 pages to do it because we needed all the details. Also, there's this concept of unembellishment in terms of life and nature. So nothing is more than what it seems. Everything is what it seems. There's not a lie. These are like real things that could really happen. Fantasy, for example, is embellished reality. It's not really real, it's the fantasy. Realism is not the fantasy. And I think that sometimes that can come across as boring, but I don't think it is boring, because I think it's just like really taking a look at people and everyday life and realizing that maybe everyday life is just as interesting as fantasy, like fighting dragons or whatever. If you really get down to the details of everyday life. I don't know if I've said this before, but I have had so many experiences in life where I'm just like, you can't make this stuff up. Like the things that are going on in my life or in people's lives who I know, it's like no one would put that in a story because it just seems wild, but it's real. And I think that it's those types of things that our authors are trying to figure out. The rest of this definition says realism rejects imaginative idealization in favor of a close observation of outward appearances. So we're not really imagining what would be ideal, right? These aren't the ideal stories. Henry James's A Beast in the Jungle, probably not ideal. The readings that we're going to look at, particularly like when we're focusing on women for the next 2 weeks, not probably ideal situations, but really real situations for a particular subset of people. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, but, you know, really close observation, again, looking at the details of what is seen. One of the things that we're going to talk about in a couple of slides is that our authors aren't really trying to interpret their characters too much. Now, I think we could fully argue that back and forth for a long time, whether our authors are providing their own interpretation by writing characters. I don't know how you can get necessarily away from those things, but the concept is that our authors are trying to be as objective as possible, maybe getting outside of, you know, the inner thought and more looking at, well, okay, if you were just watching this conversation happen, what would you see? Now, I think we have a lot of texts that don't 100% agree to that or follow that standard of realism. A lot of our characters, we hear them thinking, you know. So, I think that's debatable, but that's maybe the goal of realism, is to just, what do you see? What are the details of what you see? As our textbook talked about, some of the subsets of realism include regionalism and naturalism, and again, you know, we're looking at things like dialect and diction, and authors are going to spell their words like the way that the accent sounds. We'll see that in Kate Chopin's The Storm, especially. We see her use a lot of that kind of spelling dialect, so keep that in mind. Okay, so we have some characteristics of realism here, and I'm gonna read them and then just kind of talk a little bit about each one. So characteristics of realism: 1, renders reality closely and in comprehensive detail. Okay, so looks at reality, looks at it really up front, like takes a magnifying glass to reality, looks at the details. Again, that's why we're getting length in conversations and character. Selective presentation of reality with an emphasis on verisimilitude, which is the appearance of being true or real. So it's like your vocab word for the day. I didn't even know what that meant. Emphasis on what appears to be true, what appears to be real, even at the expense of a well-made plot. And again, here we get at this thing where I keep saying, you know, you might find realism kind of boring because we're not talking about action, and we're not talking about, you know, heroes and fighting, you know, literal, like animalistic beasts, I guess I should say. We're talking about just focusing on what appears to be real and focusing on character more than plot. That's a huge characteristic of realism. Character, moving on to the second bullet, character is more important than action and plot. Complex ethical choices are often the subject, and we're going to see that this week in week 3. Ethical choices that have been made, ethical choices that will be made, ethical choices that are being made in the moment, ethical choices of whether we should talk about the ethical choices we've made in the past, or unethical choices maybe. And so I think that that's why, you know, we get a lot of like real texts that are talking about real things that maybe if they happen to us we wouldn't necessarily admit to, but maybe. I love the texts because I feel like they just really uncover a lot of human nature, and that is the goal. That's the goal, is to really show, like, you might think that these people are like this, but here's what they're really like. You know, you might think that upper middle class women are lucky and happy and all of these things, but maybe they're actually just really bored and sad, or maybe they're immoral or unethical, you know, or something like that. So, but again, with the goal of realism, not necessarily to attack people, but to say, take a closer look and you'll see that, you know, not everything is all glittery and gold. Characters appear in their real complexity of temperament and motive. So they're not like, you know, extra heroic. They aren't, you know, running out to save the world. They're just everyday characters, especially if, you know, we're talking about particular subsets of people. They are in explicable. They are in explicable relation. That means they're in logical relation to nature, to each other, to their social class, to their own past. Logical relation to nature. They are just people living in the world. They can't, move mountains. They can't manifest fire from their hands. They can just live a life the way that you and I can. Logical relation to each other. They're friends, they're enemies, they're passive aggressive acquaintances, they're lovers, they are, again, all of the things that we are to the people that we are around. In logical relation to their social class. If they are in a lower social class, which a lot of our realism depicts middle class or upper middle class, but if they're in a lower social class, they're going to be a reflection of what it's like to be in a lower social class, not that hero who overcame poverty. They're going to be in poverty, and you're going to see the effects of poverty on them, and then to their own past, whatever that means for the character. Class is important. The realist novel has traditionally served the interests and aspirations of an insurgent middle class again. So a lot of the things we're looking at are people who don't live in poverty, who are able to, buy groceries every week and buy luxury items. And, if we're talking about women's texts, their husbands work and they stay home because that's a luxury they are afforded. If we're talking about, people who are working, they're probably working more white collar type jobs. So we are seeing a lot of our realist texts covering the middle class, and that's why we get that offshoot of naturalism, because remember, one of the critics of realism is someone who preferred naturalism over realism, and saying that, well, realism is kind of only just focusing on the intricacies of the good life. And sure, the good life might not be great, but okay, you get to decide whether you're going to cheat on your husband this week, but maybe people who aren't living the good life have to make choices that are way more brutal and way more complicated than your choices. And that's where you get naturalism, which is more of that, bloody, raw, gory kind of realism. And we'll get to that a little bit at the end of the unit. So there is a difference there. It's something to be thinking about as we're reading. It's something to think about, as I'm kind of sectioning off our readings themselves. Events will usually be plausible, likely to happen, something that could happen to you or I. Realistic novels avoid anything sensational, dramatic elements of naturalistic novels and romances. So nothing extra dramatic. There's no heroes. There's no oh, he saved her from doom kind of things. People just do what they are able to do. And there's nothing really extra about our characters unless it can be perceived as very real and very plausible. We talked about this a little bit already. Diction is natural vernacular. It's not poetic. It's not elevated. And I think that's probably why many students, if they studied early American Lit and then later American Lit, what we're looking at now, a lot of students prefer English 232 because the language changes a little bit. It becomes less poetic and less fancy. It becomes easier to kind of understand and thus identify with. The tone could be comic, it could be a satire, it could be matter of fact. I think we're getting a lot of matter of fact, especially out front, although maybe you could interpret it differently. Finally, objectivity in presentation becomes increasingly important. Like I said, overt authorial comments or intrusions diminish as the century progresses, so our authors are less likely, as we keep reading, to input, any kind of analysis or consideration of what's going on with this realism, what's the message. They're not necessarily going to tell you that outright. You're gonna have to figure it out. I also said, I think that we could argue, I think our authors are still giving us messages, and they are still, choosing to focus on these particular elements of realism for a reason. So I think there's authorial intent in everything that we read, but they're doing it maybe in a way to say, hey, you read this, you let me know what you think this means, and we'll talk about it, kind of thing. Okay, I've got a little chart here, and I think that, if you're able to take a look at this in the PowerPoint slides themselves, it might be, I don't know, worth coming back later. But if you have studied literature before the time period that we're looking at, then there's kind of an interesting, I guess, comparison between romanticism and realism. And that's, we're getting out of romanticism and we're getting into realism here. Before we might have had some characters who could do a lot of things. Maybe they were like mystical or heroes or fantasy. If you took 231 with me, then you read Rip Van Winkle, or you read why can't I think of the title, because oh well, such is life. Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with Ichabod Crane. So here we don't have characters. In realism, we don't have characters like that. We have characters who are just everyday people. Again, characters could be you or I in this, you or me or you, in this this text. Romantic plots are usually like interesting. You get mystery, you get adventure, things are happening, right? You think about Edgar Allan Poe. There is a really clear plot structure. You're following that narrative arc: rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. You're not necessarily, you're still following the narrative arc with realist texts, but identifying, okay, well, if it's just two women on a porch having a conversation, what is the rising action? What's the climax? What's the falling action? Do we even get falling action, or does the story just end with like a bang? As I think, maybe we could argue that Roman Fever does. So just plot is ordinary. There's nothing really all that exciting in terms of like action. It's not a Michael Bay film, okay? Romantics like happy endings. They like their main character to prevail. Because real life doesn't have a happy ending all the time, realism reflects that. Romantic literature has kind of inflated, formal, literary, like it sounds difficult to read kind of writing. Realism is ordinary, dialect, common vernacular. There might be times where it's difficult, if you're unfamiliar with reading dialect that is spelled the way it sounds, it might take you a little bit. But if any of you have ever read Harry Potter, a good example of that would be Hagrid and the way that Hagrid speaks. At first, maybe if you're reading chapter 1 or chapter 10 or something, where you first meet Hagrid and then you see him again, it's a little difficult to figure out, like, what is he saying, especially if you're used to reading just standard spelling. Or maybe you're not a speaker of the dialect that you're reading. But it gets easier as you go on and you just, kind of sound it out or read the sentence all at once, and it usually will make sense to you. Romantic settings can be, again, fantastical. You think about, like, Rip Van Winkle. He goes into the woods and he sees all these people and he falls asleep for a lot of time. That's mysterious. That wouldn't necessarily happen to us unless we were in a coma in the woods, which I guess could happen. Realist text, though, on the other hand, settings exist. We can visualize them because maybe we've seen pictures or we've been there. The setting can be someplace beautiful like Rome or Paris, or it could be your backyard or your kitchen, or something common. And again, romantics are interested in history, interested in legend. Realist writers are more interested in just like recent contemporary life, like what's going on now, and let me show you the reality of that. So I like this chart because I think it kind of, we could cover all of just the characteristics of realism here on the right-hand side, but I think that in understanding realism, it gets a little bit easier once we start to juxtapose it to what we have just recently been reading, or what you may be familiar with reading as well. We are going to read a lot of these realist authors: Kate Chopin, Emily Dickinson, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, William Dean Howells, Henry James, Sarah Orne Jewett, We're not reading Mark Twain. We're reading Edith Wharton and Walt Whitman. So we're skipping a couple of these authors, but we're reading a good bit of our realist authors in our first unit. And then I have this final question for consideration. I found it online with a lot of this content, you guys. Like, I haven't cited things as I should have, but I didn't write any of this, I just curated it. What was happening in the United States history between 1860 to 1890 that gave rise to the appeal of realism by American authors? And really, I think that has a lot to do with Reconstruction. So, post-Civil War, you've just had this war between two sides, and I'm simplifying, right, of the U.S., and now we have to come together and we have to rebuild. And who are we is a huge question of this time period. So who we are, I think, gives way to realist writing, in that, well, let's take a look at who we are so we can answer who are we. I think also, however, we have realist authors who aren't necessarily included in our realist list, but might be more included in naturalism. As we get into reading, immigration stories or stories of people living in America who immigrated from a different country after, America was, like, post-Civil War immigration is essentially what I'm saying. So we get stories like that. Of course, we get our authors who are trying to describe, like, what it's like to live in America and be Black in the 1875, 1865, in this time. So I think that that's a lot of this question of Reconstruction and who are we and who are we going to be, gets us to this realist text, because maybe, and I think this is up for debate, but maybe our idealist writers, the writers who came before this post-Civil War era, didn't quite give us the foundation. I mean, maybe there was a lot of idealism, but idealism is only just idealism, right? It's not real. Ideals can be thought, ideals can be attempted, but just because you have an ideal and you try it doesn't mean that what you're going to come out with is the perfect practice of that ideal. And so I think that's why we're switching from this romantic, like, what we could be, to what we are. And maybe we are not really what we could be. And so I think we're going to see, like, as we keep going forward, just this cycle through this different, realism, idealism, realism, idealism. And we could probably, try to explore that throughout the course. So anyway, these are all of the thoughts that I have on realism. I hope this is helpful for you in trying to understand our texts as we read for this unit and trying to start to make sense of your first paper. But as usual, if you guys have any questions, if you need to reach out, if you need to have a virtual meeting with me, anything like that, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I will reply or set something up. Let me know how I can help you, and otherwise, I hope you guys are doing well and enjoy the readings this week.